The Marvel Cinematic Universe is easily one of the biggest triumphs in the history of cinema. It started out small because nothing like it had been done at the time, and then it ballooned into something global, never-ending, and incredibly endearing. Even with the global pandemic, the MCU continues on, and things are aiming to be even greater as the next phase of the MCU begins. But despite all the links to the comics, and there are many things that they did differently than the comics that help set a tone for things to come. So allow us to show you the 8 best things the MCU did differently to the comics. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Number 8. The Avengers Assembled. While it may have taken multiple Avengers movies and Civil War to hear the legendary words Avengers Assemble, the first Avengers movie did indeed bring them together. And while it did follow many aspects of the original Avengers comics from the 1960s, there were some key changes that made everything feel more poignant and special. For example, both versions had Loki be the villain that brought them together, which was perfect due to Tom Hiddleston's performance in the first Thor film. However, in the comics, Loki's antics were just to get revenge on Thor, while in the movie, he was a servant of Thanos. Plus, in the comics, the team kinda just came together and beat Loki and the Avengers were formed. In the film, though, Nick Fury wanted to make a true team of heroes. They needed a push to come together and truly be a team. We got to see Tony Stark and Steve Rogers clash over ideals, Bruce Banner fear what would happen when the other guy came out, and more. When they finally did assemble, it was a major deal, and you could tell that it felt earned. Something would continue on in films to come. Number 7. I Am Iron Man.
He killed my mom. But one day you'll figure this out.
One of the biggest reasons that the MCU was a risk to start was because at the time Marvel didn't have their biggest franchises under their umbrella. Marvel Studios had just been built, and by the late 1990s and early 2000s, they had sold off the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Fantastic Four franchises to Fox and Sony. So they were left with some of the more unpopular Avengers, and the ones who weren't as mainstream as the others. And to start off the MCU with Iron Man was a huge risk. That is until the movie came out. Because with Jon Favreau leading the way in terms of direction, and Robert Downey Jr. bringing Tony Stark to life in a way no one really expected, it made for a great watch. And it may surprise you that in the comics, Tony Stark is a big character, but his comics don't sell. Even with major writers like Matt Fraction and Dan Slott behind the wheel, things just don't go well for the Armored Avenger. But in the movies, he was the leader more or less. He was the focal point of the MCU, and his death was one of the most important scenes ever in the MCU. So while he may not be the best-selling comic character, he is the reason we have one of the best movie blockbusters ever, and that's pretty cool. Number 6, Peggy Carter is a boss.
Well, the captain has some unfinished business.
What do you think?
Alright, let's be honest here. Women in comics have long been misused, misinterpreted, mishandled, and just used mainly as love interests or to show off their bodies. It's sad and it still happens to this day, but it needs to be acknowledged. And in the comics, Peggy Carter was just a basic love interest for Steve Rogers until he went under the ice. Then he would eventually hook up with her daughter, then niece, I know, comic lore's a bit weird, Sharon Carter. But in Captain America the First Avenger movie, Peggy Carter was played by Hayley Atwell, who didn't just make Peggy her own character that stood out amongst the men, she was a boss. She kicked butt, she didn't put up with crap, and she could easily hold her own. The love for Peggy Carter was so great that she went from a one-off character to being shown in multiple films, getting put occasionally in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and even getting a short-lived but beloved series via Agent Carter. Only because of Hayley Atwell is Peggy treated as more of a boss character in the comics, and for that, we should be grateful. Number 5, The Guardians of the Galaxy. Easily the biggest risk taken by Marvel after the MCU was deemed a hit is the Guardians of the Galaxy. They were always a C-list group of heroes, and their history together, well, let's just say it is complicated to say the least. Many of you probably never even heard of them before watching the first movie. But with James Gunn at the wheel, he turned this bunch of a-holes into one of the most enjoyed movies in all of the MCU. The mix of action, comedy, team building, and of course a killer soundtrack made this movie something that outshined the comics in every single way. In fact, it was only after this movie got made that the GOTG were made a bigger priority at Marvel Comics. Go figure. Number 4, going straight to Captain Marvel.
So you could live longer, stronger, superior.
To say that Carol Danvers' history in the realm of Marvel Comics is complicated is the understatement of the century. She has gone through all sorts of transformations over the years, from basic to sad to, well, odd. She was named Captain Whizbang at one point. Seriously. Anyway, everything changed in the comics for the character when Kelly Sue DeConnick transformed her into Captain Marvel after being Ms. Marvel for decades, creating Carol into one of the true leading ladies of the Marvel Comics world and cementing her as an icon. When the movie was greenlit, they made sure to go straight to the good parts, in this case taking her from human to Captain Marvel by the end of the film. Brie Larson brought the power and confidence that Carol has in the modern comics, and it really elevated the movie to new heights in all the ways that mattered. And many people are looking forward to the sequel to see how high they let Captain Marvel fly in that one. Number 3, Killmonger. Villains in the MCU are honestly hit or miss. From Whiplash to Yellow Jacket to Malekith and so on, you either really hit with villains or you don't. With Black Panther, many were curious how Michael B. Jordan would play the lower tier villain in regards to overall Marvel Universe of Killmonger in the Black Panther film. The answer to that would be epically. While the movie and comic version have certain beats that are similar, the movie take was much more modern and felt perfect given the times in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement and beyond. This wasn't a man seeking a throne for power. This was a man seeking power to overthrow those who have oppressed his people for generations. In many ways, Killmonger wasn't a villain. He was, as Michael B. Jordan noted himself, a revolutionary. He wanted change and tried to get power to make that change. After his performance, many felt Jordan should get nominated for his performance. That didn't happen, but the performance made him a standout in the MCU and easily one of the best villains the movies have produced. Number 2, Thanos and Death. Heading to the endgame now. See what I did there? Let's talk about the true big bad of the MCU for about 20 films, Thanos. How he's portrayed in the comics is similar yet very different. In the comics, Thanos has one singular goal: to bring such destruction to the universe that he'll finally be welcomed by his love, Death. Like the actual Death, the entity. Death is a female in the universe, and she has a thing for Thanos and Deadpool. I know, it gets really complicated. Anyway, in the MCU, there is a more balanced view of his villainy. He sees himself as a savior. By wiping out half of life, the other half will thrive. This take on Thanos made him not only a very compelling villain, but one that was an even deadlier threat in some ways. Because as Endgame shown, even after he won, he realized it wasn't enough, and that led him to going even farther, even if it meant getting himself killed in the process. Thanos was a worthy villain that much definitely translated from the comics. Number 1, moving on. If there's one thing comics are notorious for, it's not moving on. They are infamous, especially in the last 2 decades, for having characters die and then come back a year later in a grand event. It's honestly rather terrible, and it takes away the impact of the deaths. For the MCU though, moving on is a key part of the story. From Tony Stark training Peter Parker to be the next great superhero, to Steve Rogers passing on the mantle of Captain America to Sam Wilson, and of course, characters like Quicksilver, Agent Coulson, and Tony Stark dying, well, 2 of them died right off anyway, led to major changes that couldn't be ignored. And the next phase of Marvel will be different without 2 of the lead Avengers, especially now with the death of Chadwick Boseman. So unlike the comics, which can never seem to move ahead, the MCU is perfectly fine with that. So what do you think? What do you think of this look at the MCU and how it did certain things differently than the comics, and it paid off in major ways on many different scales? Which of these do you feel was the best change from the comics in terms of lore or characterization? What do you personally feel was the best fresh aspect of the MCU compared to the comics? And be honest, what was the worst change from the comics? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the channel.